So now we're going to look at some very specific lines, those that are parallel and perpendicular. We're going to not only be able to identify them, but we will be able to write equations that describe a line that is either parallel or perpendicular to a line that I'm going to give you. So what does it actually mean to be parallel? Well, on a graph, being parallel means that I've got lines that never meet. But it also means that the slopes of both of those lines are exactly the same. So let's look at a set of equations and see if we can determine which ones would be parallel. Well, here I see this is in slope-intercept form, so I know that this is my slope. That's 1/2. This y equals -5 is a horizontal line. That slope is 0. And y equals 1 is also a slope of 0. So that's another horizontal line. And finally, I've got y equals 1/2 x plus 1. So I've got another slope of 1/2. So I've got this equation and this equation. Those lines will be parallel. And because I've got two horizontal lines, of course, those two are going to be parallel as well. So I've got another set of equations. I need to determine which of these are parallel. Well, here I've got a slope of -3/2. Here I've got a slope of -1. Remember, if there's no coefficient to my x, that's a 1, so it's -1. Here, this is going to take a little bit more time. We're going to come back to this one in a second. And again, here, remember, this is my point slope form, and my slope here is also -1. So here I've got an equation in standard form. I'm going to need to put this into slope-intercept form in order to determine what my slope is. So I'm going to start by subtracting 3x from both sides. I get 2y equals 8 minus 3x. I have to divide everything by 2. So I get y equals 4 minus 3/2 x, which in proper slope-intercept form would look like -3/2 x plus 4. So indeed, I have a slope here of -3/2. So these two lines are going to be parallel, and when I graph these two lines will also be parallel. Okay, so I want to prove that this shape is a parallelogram. Well, I know that a parallelogram has two sets of parallel sides. Well, what would I do with that to prove that? Well, I'm going to determine what the slope is of these two opposite sides to see if they are parallel. And if I can prove that both sets of opposite sides are parallel, then indeed I have a parallelogram. So I've got this side AB, and I'm going to determine the slope for AB, and the slope there is 2 minus 2 over 4 minus 0, so I have 0 over 4, or 0. And I want to make sure that DC has the same slope. Well, DC is -3 minus a -3 over 1 minus a -3. So that's going to be 0 over 4, which is also 0. So I know so far that these two lines are parallel. So now I've got to prove that these two lines are parallel, so I'm going to find the slope of BC. BC's slope is 2 minus a -3 over 4 minus 1, which means I have a slope of 5 over 3. Now, if AD has the same slope, then these two lines are also going to be parallel. So my slope is 2 minus a -3 over 0 minus a -3, so my slope is 5 over 3. So in fact, AD and BC are also parallel. So I've got two sets of parallel lines, so in fact I have a parallelogram. So moving on from parallel lines, I'm going to look at perpendicular lines. Of course, perpendicular lines form 90-degree angles, but more importantly for this lesson, I'm looking for the slope having a product of -1 so that I multiply the slope of those two lines. If they equal -1, then I have perpendicular lines. So here I've got y equals -1, therefore my slope is 0. I've got a horizontal line. Here I've got a slope of -1/5. Here I have a slope of 5, and here I've got a vertical line, x equals 4. Of course, I don't have a slope, that's undefined, but I know that this horizontal line, of course, is going to be perpendicular to a vertical line. And I've got these two slopes here. If -1/5 can be multiplied by 5 to get -1, and indeed it does, then these two lines are also perpendicular. I want to prove that I have a right triangle here. So in order to prove that I have a right triangle, I need to show that this line PQ is perpendicular, and you'll learn this in geometry, that sign says perpendicular, to PR. So I'm going to need to find the slope of PQ and the slope of PR, and if their product is -1, then they are indeed perpendicular, and therefore I have a right triangle. So the slope of PQ is 6 minus 4 over 2 minus 1, or 2 over 1. And my slope of PR is 1 minus 4 over 7 minus 1, so I have -3 over 6, or -1/2. And in fact, 2 times -1/2 is -1, so these two lines are perpendicular. Their slopes, the product of their slopes, is -1. Therefore, I know that this is a right triangle. Now I want to write an equation in slope-intercept form for a line that passes through the point 5, -6, and is parallel to the line described by y equals -x plus 3. So I know several things already. I know that my new line is going to have a slope that is the same. Remember, this is parallel, so it has to have the same slope as this line. And I see here that my slope is -1. So I've got a point, and I know my slope is going to be -1 in order to be parallel. So I'm going to use my point slope form to find my equation. So I've got y minus a -6 equals the slope times x minus 5. I'm going to simplify this. Equals -1 times, and I'm going to move my 6 to the other side, and I get y equals -x minus 1. So this line is in fact parallel to my original equation, y equals -x plus 3, and I know that because they both have a slope of -1. Now I want to find a line that is perpendicular to a given line, and I'm going to do that by first finding the appropriate slope. Well, I see here that my slope is -4, so I know that my slope for a perpendicular line, the product of those two slopes has to equal -1. So -4 times the slope of my new line has to equal -1. So if I divide both sides by -4, I know that my new slope has to be 1/4. So now I have a slope and I have a point. I'm going to use that good old point slope form. I get y minus 5 equals 1/4 x minus 8. Go ahead and solve for y. Add 5. And I have y equals 1/4 x plus 3. And this line will in fact be perpendicular to this line, -4x plus 7. And I know that because the product of their slopes is -1. I've got 2 more here for you. Go ahead and pause the slide, find your new equations, and then come back and check your answers. If you have any questions about the video, please post those on the last question of your quiz.